Abimelech's one of the most controversial figures in the Bible, but he's also one of the most exciting because he's a warrior, he's a bit of a gangster, a bit of a rogue. Abimelech was born in the town of Schechem, which was a city really, a large city in the north of the Israelite kingdom. And Abimelech was an ambitious young man, aristocratic. He was the son of the great judge Gideon and Gideon's slave girl, so he was actually illegitimate, but he was recognised as the son of Gideon, and so he thought that he might have a bit of a chance of running the country. The only problem was that he had 70 brothers, so he went to the guys who lived in Shechem, who were like his mother's relatives, and he said to them, "Look, who would you want to rule you? 70 men or one? Remember, I'm your relative." And the guys from Shechem said, "We'll fund you, but you sort the issue out." So they went to the temple of Baal of the Covenant, and Baal of the Covenant was a god that was worshipped there in Shechem. They got from the temple coffers 70 pieces of silver, because in those days they used to keep a lot of riches in temples and so on. And they gave the 70 pieces of silver to Abimelech, and Abimelech took the 70 pieces of silver and he hired a bunch of brigands, or a bunch of worthless and spiteful young men. He hired them and they went around with him as like a gang, you know, that was his crew. Once he'd hired these guys, he went to take care of his brothers, and he sacrificed them all on a stone, hacked them to pieces and cut their heads off, and the blood, you know, flowed all over the stone, fertilised the ground, and Abimelech stood triumphant over his brothers and all of the men that he had to go around with him, and the men of Shechem pronounced Abimelech king of Israel. And Abimelech stood in power and defiance with his sword, and then a voice from the distance called out, "Abimelech, Abimelech, what have you done?" And it was Jotham, the youngest brother. Jotham had escaped, and Abimelech didn't know, and now Jotham was at the top of the mountains that surround Shechem, and he was shouting to his brother, "Abimelech, how could you have killed our brothers? Do you know what evil you've brought on this land?" And he said that fire would come out from Abimelech and burn up Shechem and burn up all the men that had supported him. Abimelech, of course, angry, enraged, but Jotham ran away. He disappeared and he went to live in another part of Canaan, far away from his brother. So Abimelech went about his business and he went back to running the country. And he ran Israel for 3 years. Many of the men who financed his revolution began to resent his power. And Abimelech's capital was in a different part of Israel to Shechem. And the men there got together and began to, you know, talk about perhaps overthrowing him. And there was a man called Gal who'd been away when Abimelech had come to power, but now he'd returned. And he had his own gang of men. But Abimelech had left his governor in charge of Shechem by the name of Zebul. And Zebul was loyal to Abimelech. And Gal was drinking at the feasting table. And he said, "You know, this worthless Abimelech, I'll destroy him any time I like," and all this. And Zebul said, "Oh, will you now?" And he said, "Yeah, just see if I won't. And first of all, I'm going to start by taxing the people." So Gal put his men outside the city, and there were people, you know, trading on the roads and walking on the mountain paths and so on that were under Abimelech's protection. This Gal started robbing people on the roads, causing all kinds of trouble, taxing people, when really everyone should only pay a bit of tax to Abimelech, obviously, if he's in control. And Zebul on his own was powerless to stop him, but he sent a message to Abimelech, and he said, "Abimelech, you know, this guy Gal, he's talking against you, he's robbing people on the road, he's saying he's going to overthrow you, you've got to get back here and do something about it. You know, I thought we were supposed to be under your protection." Abimelech gets on his horse and rides all day, and By the time he approaches Shechem, it's getting dark, it's dusk, and Shechem is surrounded by hills. It's in a valley, right? You've got the desert down below and there's hills with scrub on at the top. And Abimelech split his troops into three, and he sent one left, one right, and he took the middle. Zebul and Gad were stood just outside the city walls of Shechem, and they were watching the hills. And Gal said, "I'm sure I can see someone coming down the hills." And Zebul said, "Nah, it's just shadows, mate. You know, that's all you can see, shadows on the hills." Gal said, "No, I can definitely see someone on the hills." And Zebul said, "It's Abimelech. Come on, where's all your big words now?" And it was the shadows of Abimelech's men running down the hills. So Gal got his men together, and Abimelech, of course, the great warrior, rushed in, and he started slaughtering the men left, right and centre, because Gal was no match for Abimelech. And Gal and what was left of his elite guard ran into the city of Shechem, locked the gates. So Abimelech, crazy with fury, ran all around the fields outside the city, hacking and slashing civilians to pieces. And then he ran to the city gate, smashed through the gate, his men ran in, and Gal and the others in panic ran to the temple of Baal of the Covenant, and they locked themselves in. And Abimelech couldn't smash down the door, so he said to his men, "Follow me," and they ran away to the forests. And Abimelech got a huge branch of cedar and dragged it back and piled it against the temple of Baal of the Covenant. And then all his men did the same until there was a huge pile of timber around the temple. He set fire to the timber, and it burnt the temple of Baal of the Covenant and burnt 1,000 men and women and children in that temple. And Abimelech was Lord once more. He burnt the rest of the city, slaughtered all the civilians, killed everyone, killed the cattle, killed the men, the women, the children, the dogs and cats, and he razed the city to the ground, ploughed salt into where the city had been. And this is his own city, don't forget, his hometown. But there was more descent further down the valley in the city of Thebez, a Canaanite city. They'd heard news of the revolt that was going on in Shechem, and they'd also revolted. When Abimelech rode to the city, he found the battle was already in progress. His own Israelite troops were already fighting. It's all through the streets, packed with people, hacking each other, slashing each other, screaming. The sounds of women and children running, crying, you know, parts of the city on fire. And there you could just see, you know, Abimelech with his armour on and his sword, hacking and slashing his way through the crowd, cutting a path to the tower, because there in the tower the leaders of the Canaanites were. They'd taken refuge, no one could get in there. And Abimelech, with all his strength and all his might, gets to the bottom of the tower. He's exhausted, you know, he looks up at the tower and he says, "Who dares defy Abimelech, Lord of Israel?" And a woman, a little woman, is perched in the top of the tower with a millstone balanced on the windowsill, and she pushes the millstone out of the window just as Abimelech's looking up, and down the millstone falls and smacks Abimelech on the top of the head, and his skull's cracked, you know, and he hits the ground and he's done for. Bits of brain are on the ground behind him, but he's still got strength in him yet. And he grabs his squire, a young boy, and he says, "Boy, run me through. Let it not be said that I was killed by a woman." And the squire's afraid because he's just a young boy, but he dare not defy his master. So he draws his sword and he runs Abimelech through. And there, like a spell lifted from the Israelites, the hypnosis of Abimelech's gone, and all the Israelites stop fighting. Peace returns to the city streets in seconds, and they all just go home back to their own villages. Why would Abimelech be seen as evil? Let's examine it. Well, first of all, he takes silver from the temple of Baal of the Covenant and he kills his own brothers. on a stone. Now in those times, stone was like an altar, an ancient altar. So in a sense it's a sacrifice. And this is why Abimelech's regarded as evil, really. This is his most evil act. Forget about killing women and children and so on. That's not considered an evil act in the eyes of Yahweh. What's considered an evil act in Yahweh's eyes is the idolatry, the doing the bidding of another god, which is what Abimelech's done in a certain respect, but not entirely. Now silver is like the currency of evil in traditional times. Saul pays silver to visit the fortune teller. Jesus is sold out for silver by Judas Iscariot, and here we can see Abimelech's been bought with silver, right? But Abimelech's motives are not for Baal of the covenant. Abimelech's motives are human motives, because Abimelech is out for himself. He's utterly human in his desires and his wishes. He's the man who is beyond all others when it comes to seeking power. There's nothing he will not do to gain power over other men. But it's not power over God. He doesn't seek to destroy Yahweh in the eyes of the people of Israel. He destroys the temple of Baal of the covenant when he burns it to the ground. So that proves that he doesn't actually give a damn about Baal, number one. And number two, he never leads the people of Israel towards worshipping the Baals. All he does is use Baal's money to get his own power. So his motives are not in leading the people of Israel astray. And this is why Abimelech still retains his place in the book of Judges. Now, a second interesting thing about Abimelech is actually he's a king. He's the king of Israel. Traditionally, Saul's regarded as the first king of Israel. But we can see here in the story of Abimelech that actually Abimelech is the first king of Israel. Now, some Jews will say that Abimelech is not the king of Israel because there were just a bunch of guys, who crowned him king, but that didn't really make him king. But this is not entirely true, because the Bible says there in plain Hebrew that Abimelech was king over all Israel and ruled for 3 years as king and was recognized as such by the whole of Israel. So Abimelech was king. Now some other more learned Jews will say that, well, Abimelech, he might have been crowned king over all of Israel, but he wasn't an anointed king. He wasn't Yahweh's chosen king. All Abimelech was a man who made himself king in defiance of Yahweh. And so if you haven't been anointed by a prophet, for example, then you're not Yahweh's chosen king, so you're not the true king of Israel. And so that to me sounds more of a plausible explanation for the fact that he's not the true king of Israel. Another thing is that the guy who wrote, the man who wrote the Bible, this section of it, he might have just used the term king as a kind of a slur on Abimelech, because the monarchy traditionally is not, it's not regarded as good and pure in the eyes of the Israelite traditionalists and the people who wrote the Bible and so on. The monarchy, in a sense, is the decline of Israel, because Israel begins as a theocracy. Theocracy means God is in charge of the country, and then it transitions to the period of the Judges, which is an anarchy, and then after the anarchy, the Israelites cry out for a king, and they get a monarchy. But Israel, in its foundation, was never supposed to be a monarchy. So, and by the way, most of the kings, with the exception of Solomon, perhaps even David, are all in some ways wicked in the eyes of Yahweh. So the monarchy is not liked, and it's possible that Abimelech's status was as judge but because the judges cannot be criticised too much, the author has used the term king instead as a slur on Abimelech.